Hello everyone, today we talk about the organization of the Carolingian army in a nutshell, I believe, because this is such a huge topic, telling the truth, that cannot be covered, not even if I stayed in here speaking for 30 consecutive hours. And so we're gonna essentially introduce the Carolingian army. This is the first video I actually make on the Carolingian army, and I don't know why. It's purely a random coincidence, as I randomly picked my topics. Naturally, yeah, well, there are dynamics now I want to explain to you, but I will obviously make many other videos on the Carolingian army, specifically on it, or better, sometimes even trying to explain the development of the high medieval, let's say, heavier cavalry that started occurring to the Carolingian times. So there will be plenty of occasions to discuss more the topic more thoroughly. For today, I would just like to give a plain introduction without any extreme deepening, but really trying to cover the wall as much as possible. And we're gonna stick, in fact, essentially, not to to the organization, to the Carolingian army in general. We're not going to talk about tactics specifically, but rather how the army was organized, and generally speaking, how the whole empire revolved around the military organization, because this is actually what the Carolingians were, and what the Franks, generally speaking, at that point really were. Now, I won't make comparisons with other peoples, but I think on other videos, especially the ones on the, well, not really, I haven't really discussed this period much in my videos. I will have to try to do it sooner or later. I think I've never made a video about the Carolingians specifically, so there are many missing parts. But okay, let's just give a frame. Excuse me, I drink a little before I start. So let's go by, let's introduce something thematically speaking. First of all, I think one important part of the understanding the Carolingian army organization is to look at how the empire was really about in nature. So essentially the Carolingian empire, just like the previous Merovingian empire, though as we all know, the Merovingian empire had sort of decline. During especially the 7th century, there was nothing like a true empire proper, as the native lands of the Franks had basically split into several kingdoms. This because the Franks divided the Merovingian dynasty divided their domains every generation among the male sons. So this had been a problem for the cohesion of the empire, and naturally there had been other structural factors. Sometimes I kind of even struggle to name the Merovingian kingdom a Merovingian empire, but I think the imperial, because this is just a matter of definition, what is an empire objectively. I like to stress the nature of the empire, especially for the Franks, in spite of, doesn't matter how fragmented they were politically speaking, because objectively, and I made a video about Clovis relatively to this point. The Franks had created essentially a dominion over the surrounding populations, chiefly the Burgundians, the Alemanni, the Aquitanians, parts of the Thuringia, etc. They extended certain their patronage, if you want. Their kind of protectorate, let's say, over other entities like Bavaria, etc. They always had also a huge influence naturally over lands that they never fully dominated, like Bretagne, for instance, or over the Frisians that were also pretty rebellious. So now we're not gonna make a history of this, but just to stress, there was this nucleus made up by Francia proper, that is the lands in which the Franks had expanded into the end of the late antique and early medieval times, that in turn were also pretty much differentiated lands on their own. The Western Neustria and the Eastern Austrasia. The Carolingians, by the way, were Austrasians in origin. They came from the very frontier of the Frankish kingdom, and these two lands were actually pretty different, and they would grow to be pretty diverse in many ways. The Neustria corresponds roughly to today's northern France. Austrasia encompassed other territories such as the Benelux, parts of northwestern Germany, and the Neustria was much more, say, civilized. Let's use it without any derogatory term for Austrasia. Austrasia was less urbanized, was much closer actually to Saxony. If you look at, I mean, closer in culture, in tradition to it was mostly a Germanic land, while Neustria already was developing a sort of Romance language and different identity. And this is important to stress, because Austrasia is often, we think, like the Franks and the Saxons were like cats and dogs, but it's not really like that. I mean, perhaps behaviorally they really didn't like much each other, but they were extremely similar, especially if you look at how the law was really, how the legal system functioned, and all these oral traditions, and the few we can know also from the Saxons and from especially the later Carolingian conquest. These were peoples that had actually a lot in common, and also fighting constantly on the frontier had partly brought to that over time. But hey, these were essentially in origin all Germanic tribes, and were also pretty close. However, the important thing, and why I call this an empire, is essentially, and other people call it an empire, of course, is that this nucleus, more or less cohesive nucleus of the Francia, ruled over all these surrounding peoples. And these surrounding peoples, telling the truth, especially during the 7th century, but even in origin when they were conquered, let's say, by the Franks, had kept enjoying a substantial degree of autonomy, simply because it was really the political and social dynamics that couldn't make at that time a people effectively rule with iron fist over one another, especially after the decline of the Merovingian power. These populations had basically remained, just like in other areas of Francia proper, pretty autonomous, with the local aristocracies that at this time were essentially an hybrid between the Frankish counts and the say ethnic local ethnic aristocracy, had blended in, and they pursued also a certain autonomistic politics that ended up in several cases also with repression. I made a video about the Alemanni some time ago, which deals with even this transformation. Sometimes we, even in later times, like even into the High Middle Ages proper, even up to the 12th century, we, looking especially at Germany, we say, oh, this place was called Alemannia, for instance, or Thuringia, etc. So these must have been the same people, the same descendants of the old Alemanni or the old Thuringians, etc. But it wasn't really so. It had been a huge transformation, as these entities, not even in the Carolingian times, corresponded anymore properly to the, let's say, tribal confederations that had formed into the migration era. As, by the way, these were kind of fictions entities in practice, as we have seen on the videos on the migration era. These confederations were just names that were used internationally speaking to define that union of tribes, but within these populations actually there were other ethnonyms and other identities that were also pretty diverse, and these populations had blended in with other non-Germanic peoples. They so it's very complicated, but when we look at this in this single entity in the historiography of the Frankish in Frankish historiography is called the Teilreich, that is literally a part of the empire. So this had developed on the base of dynamics that were actually pretty complex, but that mostly had this territorial cohesion because of, I don't know, environmental reasons. Take Burgundy. Burgundy had been invented practically by the Romans because they had forcibly settled the Burgundians there, and so that area started to be called like Burgundia, even if they had another name before. So there were certain, say, strategical balances that had maintained a unity of intent, of aims, into this single, essentially, is single chunks of the empire, let's say, which had some kind of local autonomy, some local identity. Excuse me, I drink a little bit more. Yeah. Sorry. But at this time didn't correspond properly to a national identity as such, and it's complicated because at this time the modern identities were still only being very approximatively taking sort of shape somewhat. Usually it's the Carolingian times that see especially this macroscopic division between Eastern Francia and Western Francia as roughly today's Germany and France, but this is kind of an embryonal state. It still has obviously to define, and also in here it mostly emerged from an aristocratic propaganda, because it was actually the local aristocrats who ruled over these populations that otherwise didn't feel actually much in common, albeit they had, but they had no awareness of that. That decided to say, okay, we are, becoming things like the Teutonici, for instance, in Latin. These were terms that were invented in the great scriptoria of St. Gallen or Reichenau. So even, entities that had a very few to do with the vulgar, let's say, the popular feelings, but that were trying to stress a local identity to better control these unities and this largely started also from Carolingian times, given also the new organization that the Carolingians gave to their own lands. All this premise, perhaps was a bit unnecessary given the today's topic, was to say that the Frankish armies at this time were largely built up by these all these populations coming together. They were kind of multi-ethnical in many ways. If you look at, for instance, the campaign that was led at the end of the 8th century against the Avars, against the Avar Khaganate, if you look at the ethnical composition, you see that there were Ripuarian and Salian Franks that were the major, the older ethnical repartitions of the same Frankish people. The Saxons that by this time had been already invaded by the Carolingians, the Thuringians, the Frisians, the Alemanni, the Bavarians, the Longobards, etc. So all populations that were actually joining in the Frankish army because they were obliged, obviously, to do that, and to contribute with their manpower to the strength of the, let's say, of the Carolingian armies. Even if you look at the civil war that occurred between 840 and 41, the Frankish armies included the Neustrians, the Austrasians, then Burgundians, Aquitanians, the Saxons, and the Bavarians. So these to understand what these ethnical contingents were really about, we should look a bit closer to the organization, essentially of the same empires, because the the Franks at this point were essentially strengthening kind of let's say of an administrative system that entailed the sending of Frankish counts into the wall all over the empire. So obviously also outside the Frankish borders proper of now Austrasia to rule over the conquered population. And this had, as we've seen, had already been the case since very early age, but at this time was being re-strengthened because, by the way, what the Carolingians practically had done was to reconstruct the Frankish, to rebuild the Frankish monarchy from the decline of the Merovingian one. So this had occurred through fielding their own military clientele, so they brought from Austrasia and that progressively expanded throughout all over the empire to subdue this and that population and trying to take him back what those would had been the public, let's say, the royal better possessions that had been usurped during the moment of the phase of decline of the Merovingian Empire. This was I'm approximating brutally here, but this is the concept in the essential. This is this is how the same feudal system started, the situation in which the feudal system started to emerge as a system proper, in the sense that naturally the term feudal is anachronistic for Carolingian times. There wasn't such a thing like a feudal system proper. We still talk about the Vassalatic-Beneficiary system, but in a nutshell, I mean, I've seen the term feudal used historiographically speaking to define even much less structured systems. From this point of view, I made a video that can help in this, that is the one on, if you go into, I don't know if it is the Carolingian Europe playlist, yes, the Frankish Commendatio, at the origins of the Vassalatic-Beneficiary system, that kind of gives you an idea of how, in this sense, the Carolingians didn't really even invent anything new, but they simply reinforced this clientelary system by essentially entrusting land to a certain, to their clients, essentially, that were mostly military clients. I mean, they were their own soldiers, those who had been fighting together with them. These were all aristocrats, even though during Carolingian times, in this sense, the aristocracy was also pretty much opened. There was a relatively high social mobility, especially in the very first phase. So also this idea of entrusting the land to someone in order for him to provide a military retinues to you was something that already existed, but that in Carolingian times was massively expanded, arguably standardized all over the empire as the ruling system, by the way, because the Franks, and I cannot stress this enough, had a practically non-existent idea of what the public actually is about, public authority. The Franks had an extremely private mentality. They thought that everything belonged to someone in a private fashion. It was the monarchs who had given the example to this, as the Merovingians had basically surpassed this Germanic freeman's ideal, for which it was about the Franks, but now it was about the Merovingian dynasty. It was about the dynasty who owned literally everything. Doesn't matter if there was still a kind of a public law, if everything was still perceived in kind of an ethical fashion from the Frankish point of view. In Merovingian and Carolingian times, everything was basically owned by the local aristocrats, who regarded those possessions, whether or another, belonging to them personally. And what the Merovingians had done had been basically to strengthen enormously their dynastic power on the basis of such privatization, so that everything theoretically belonged to the king personally. And this is where also the feudalism stems from, because it's the idea that the land is not just properly public, it's of the king as such. And in other peoples, this meant by the king as a more public authority of the whole people. In the Frankish case, it really meant de facto the private property of the sovereign. And in the Merovingian kingdom, in the Carolingian kingdom or empires, or whatever you want to call them, in de facto, what you see is that everybody reasoned in this fashion, that the aristocracies, these enormously powerful aristocracies, definitely augmented their own power in Carolingian times because of this progressive stratification, because as feudalism practically pushed for this impoverishment of the lower classes, of the middle classes, and in the concentration of the wealth in the hands of a very few. This had never happened before in such measure, especially in the Germanic world. But previously to this system, even if with lesser social stratification, already existed as such. De facto, during the fragmentation of the Merovingian empire, the local aristocracies had taken over and had built their own lordships on their own. So what the Carolingians were doing now they didn't even obviously have the force to reverse this, but they kept essentially pushing for it. They started saying, okay, we managed to restore a certain military power. We lead it because the Carolingian rule was based essentially on military expeditions, and the empire functioned as long as there was a military expedition that could be mounted up against an external enemy that in this sense could be conquered, and say some land could be distributed to the Carolingian vassals, and it doesn't matter whether they were, I don't know, Saxon pagans, for instance, or Aquitanian Christians. It doesn't matter. It was really a structural thing. As long as this system could be fueled, the system held. But nothing really structural, like a central power, a public authority, was really built, because this existed by name, but it was only standing because of these private retinues that made up the whole Frankish political and military system. So as long as these vassals were entrusted, the land, and this system went on. When the empire overstretched and was basically now more a defensivistic attitude, as by the way the second invasion started and all, these local vassals began essentially to autonomize themselves, and the whole system collapsed. More enlightened minds like Charlemagne and Louis the Pious had somewhat understood that a more centralized system had to be necessarily created, the idea of the public authority to be reinforced, and this is why they recurred, especially to the help of the church, by entrusting the church much of these properties, and trying, because the church was obviously functioning in a slightly different way than the lay aristocracy. Although this ecclesiastical aristocracy in the Carolingian world was still made up by the same people by the same aristocrats, as bishops, abbots, abbesses, and all came from the same aristocracy, that the same lay aristocracy that the central power was trying to stem in their autonomistic pushes. So this whole system collapsed. So when you look at the Carolingian Empire, never think it's something that had you have always necessary to think of the private nature of its power that was based exclusively on these clienteles. And there were naturally different strategies that you could carry out by, obviously entrusting some, making, an internal competition for getting the most powerful fiefs, and and there was this also generational um, how do you say that, a replacement. Especially think about Charlemagne, who lived so much for those times. He definitely saw generations of vassals to change, to renew over the times, and there was a way to play a little bit in this dynamics, but the world system was really grounded on the private nature of power. So this could not basically last for long, and this is why the Carolingian Empire eventually dissolved, if you want, so speedily. It wasn't really a matter of the second invasions. It was really about the internal cohesion of the empire that was founded on premises that, as long as the empire stopped expanding, were not functioning anymore. And if you really want to look at the second invasions as more of as a consequence of the Carolingian decline rather than a cause of the Carolingian decline, because such piracy, monarchy, and stuff start to happen at all times when great empires begin to crumble. The same went. There are many similarities with the Roman Empire. Actually, obviously, there were very different things. But at a broader structural level, this is more or less how the dynamic really went. So this was a moment into which the local vassals also tried to stress the local identity and cohesion, because if you were an aristocrat who ruled over a certain county or march, and you had to basically start your own lordship from there, because you realized that in the meanwhile the central power was collapsing, you were naturally pushed to stress the local cohesion of the community, to actually be oriented towards the creation of your new power on that base. So also in here, or these ethnical contingents do not have to be understood as these peoples like the Burgundians, the Franks, the Barbarians, the Longobards, the Alemanni, etc., that were joining the Franks. It was really the same local Frankicized or Frankish, I don't know how to say that, nobility that levied troops from the various recruitment districts of the empire, and therefore providing, in fact, this foreign contingents at that point that bore the name of wherever they came from: Thuringia, Frisia, Saxony, etc. And by the way, over time, I must say that this system was a sort of gluing factor. Naturally, we like to stress the fact that eventually the Carolingian Empire crumbled, but at the same time, if you look on the longer range, you realize that in spite of these political institutions obviously evaporated, but the essence of the system, in terms of political and social order at a local level, was extremely influenced by the Carolingian Empire. It basically all started there in terms of feudalism and there was arguably a collective identity in terms of, we belong to an empire that functioned in a certain way, with a certain, even a public authority that we have seen how feeble it had been, but that survived over times. It's not that at the end of the Carolingian Empire all these ethnic blocks kind of gained freedom from the Carolingian oppression or something like that. It doesn't make any sense. These populations were all basically Frankicized and feudalized in a way that they would build up what is de facto the core of feudal Europe. So these the same areas over which the Franks had ruled. Think about Germany. Ways that in the 10th century kind of recovers the empire and gets it. Germany, the Saxons themselves, the Teutonians. So the populations that had been more hostile, the more resilient against the Frankish domination, at least up to a certain point, given that they were raised eventually. But it's paradoxical how, and not so much if you understand the interests of the elites, how feudalism spread and it even became more functional among populations that had known it from a more recent time and that had been more extraneous to it, originally speaking. This is not something you see just with the Ottonians in the 10th century. This is something you see, for instance, with the Normans back into the 10th and 11th century. Eventually, these Normans that were essentially Vikings in origins, they came from Scandinavia, where there was an extremely low social stratification. They were the ones who managed to export the feudal model to make it the most functional, even more functional than the same French one at that time, or better say Western Frankish one, in England and in Sicily. So this is very important because it makes you understand that even this kind of national perspective is kind of non-existent. It was really mostly an aristocratic process that sometimes stressed naturally the belonging to a certain context, but just to a certain geographical national context, let's say, that only to stress its own local prerogatives and kind of justifying its own power on those bases. And really, Europe, especially certain areas of it, really changed its face after Carolingian conquest, because this system, Vassalatic-Beneficiary system, had really changed radically the balance of power in various lands. And in this sense, it was essentially the Frankish model of the Frankish society that was exported into these other lands, like into Germany, into Italy, into other areas that eventually even kind of mutated it by osmosis. Think about Spain, that was practically, except for the northeastern mark, and the Catalan mark was not conquered by the Carolingians, but eventually by the 12th century was so heavily Francicized in many ways. The same goes for the Slavs on the eastern frontier. So it's very it was a model. It was a winning model. It was a definitely a at least by there were naturally also other kind of dynamics. I have a general interpretation of how the freeman system was kind of declining, and it was meant to decline over time especially into the Germanic world that had kept it more alive. So this process, according to me, was happening already somewhat in other regions, like especially if you look at if you take the Longobard Kingdom, if you take this progressive social stratification was slowly taking place, also in the Slavic world, but the Franks overly accelerated this. So it was really taking away lots of lands, putting it in the hands of these local counts that had to rule everything and really transforming society. Into Germany, at a certain point in the mid of the 19th century, there was a revolt that saw something absurd would have been considered as absurd in other times. There was the local freemen allying themselves with the local slaves, de facto, against this Frankish nobility, because they realized, as freemen, that they would have soon turned like into serfs, into slaves, had this system taken root. Obviously, in Germany, it took actually much longer, because Germany knows the full feudal system only from the second half of the 12th century. That also in there the social dynamics were very different from the ones of France, for instance. But definitely this process, in a way or another, took place at a speedier or slower rate, in more or less in a more or less intense way. But the Frankish feudalism expanded everywhere, from from central Italy to the Danish border, from the Catalonian Mark to the Elbe river. It was something that really made grow this great area of Central Europe essentially becoming more homogeneous. And this is basically the bulk of feudal Europe as we conceive it, even in its more grave consequences in later centuries. It all started from here. So the idea here about the Carolingian army, it's also another debated question, is about the composition of the army. So at this point, the main problem is really how this problem of the rise of cavalry as such. So definitely at this time in the West there were no fully mounted armies, and there would have practically never been, as there had never been also in the past. But what we see is the extreme rise in power of cavalry. So Charlemagne's armies, just making an example, would be made up largely from a numerical point of view by infantry, and was actually, by the way, in essentially exactly under the reign of Charlemagne, there was seemingly an increase in the number of infantry levies proper, because at this point the empire had basically consolidated it. I mean, Charlemagne carried out the greatest conquest, so more or less the Carolingian Empire remained of the same borders Charlemagne had created. And the problem at this point that we reach the apex, and also the beginning of the end in a certain measure, with the as the empire was overstretched, and at this point it couldn't be really expanded more than much, and the main problem was actually to keep all these lands, these populations, under the control of the Franks. This could be done if only the local levies, the local garrisons, had been reinforced. So the role of infantry, so this military service owed to the public by the local communities, so the rise of infantry as essentially especially a decentralized force that could could work essentially as a garrison to maintain order at a local level. However, what we still see, and there was eventually a decline in this, because this was a system that was mostly imposed. So these were the Carolingians at this very point that tried to create a sort of this is how the moment into which the Carolingian Empire was more centralized, and therefore Charlemagne and Louis the Pious tried to kind of create a greater engagement of the local communities for the military service, for keeping order, but it was largely something destined to fail. In previous times, really, infantry had been less important, and in ensuing times it would also start to lose importance, while instead the cavalry was increasingly gaining steam as essentially the bulk of the Carolingian strengths from a military point of view. So many people say, why did cavalry increase this time? Well, this is a huge topic we can't discuss, because otherwise we'll make a 7 hours video. But I will definitely do this in another time. Let's just say that, at least from my point of view, the main factor was the Vassalatic-Beneficiary system and how it had been conceived. The empire was huge, and even when since the rise of the Carolingians from the end of the 7th century, but more properly at the beginning of the 8th, the Carolingians had to deal with actually a huge dominion. So this happened also in many other contexts, and when you especially have to, it's a very unstable dominion because it was, and you need to go always back and forth with the army to suppress this and that population because it's rebelling. You need fast moving armies. So the increase of cavalry at this point was an obvious need, and the Vassalatic-Beneficiary system was kind of shaped also on the base of this idea, so that you need cavalry, you need an essentially a professional army more than else, not even necessarily cavalry, but you can essentially achieve both things if you give, in fact, such a huge amount of land to the single vassal. So by doing this, the Carolingians formed progressively throughout their own clienteles a solid bulk of mounted professionals of war that were essentially they had a prepaid service. The land was at that time there was a scarce monetary circulation. The Carolingians kind of set up a bit something more in motion, but largely was a was a lot of barter. It was a largely agrarian society, agrarian economy. The greatest wealth at the time was definitely the land. So the land was used to pay, indeed, in hardware, let's say, and this was the real point. Having a vassal that was faithful to you because he got his land from you, and he had to return it at a certain point, maybe when he died. So this idea of passing the land from generation, handing down the land from generation to generation, something that in practice, telling the truth, already existed even in the early times, but it got basically a rule de facto only in later times. As long as central authority, in the sense, had been strong, it could claim that land back, or at least better to have some sort of control on who could go there. And this is also partly of the paradox. It wasn't not even at the peak of the Carolingian authority possible to claim that land back physically. It was really, replacing people who would go there. So it was a system that kind of fueled by itself and was kind of expanding on its own, and stressing increasingly, especially the individual power of these vassals as also organizers of war. But the idea, in fact, was also, if you take the smaller vassals, to have this huge amount of land could allow them to provide for their own military equipment, for their training, also in times of peace that actually didn't exist in the Carolingian world, because it was a rare eventuality that in one season there would not be a campaign. I mean, every single year there was at least one or even more campaigns, and this meant that the training practically occurred during the same military campaigns. There was not even much to do, and these were soldiers that were fighting. In fact, for all their lives, they spent their lives on horseback, and it was the craft of war was really what they were living for. There was no other horizon in the Carolingian mentality. It was really all about that. Also here, unfortunately, we don't have time to go in detail, and I'm kind of annoyed by how fast I have to go on these topics that are so crucial to understand the history of the Carolingians. But the important is that this Vassalatic-Beneficiary system was aimed at providing this pool of mounted warriors, of heavy cavalry, of seasoned warriors that could join every year into the Carolingian expeditions and go essentially exercising this deterrent force over all the populations of the empire, also their enemies abroad. It was really continuous. This was a machine that basically shaped itself by sheer use. It wasn't also in here a matter of of a centralized organization that directed everything from the above. No, it was largely a society was already largely militarized since the beginning, and that kept essentially increasing most of all its organization. And the Carolingians were able to essentially orient the society towards this military function. They started building warehouses and stations, and because it was mostly a logistical problem, especially with the increase of cavalry, it was needed at this point to go back and forth on the frontiers of the empire. You needed, locally speaking, even a certain amount of the local surplus to be necessarily dedicated to feeding these armies that went back and forth. So the same Vassalatic-Beneficiary system was based on this, because the vassals did not have just to provide for their own equipment, participating into the army, but they also had to leave a substantial amount of their local agricultural surplus for feeding the army as a whole. At this time there is also the point that there was not really a capital of the empire, so that everything really shifted according to obviously the core of Francia was the Francia remained kind of the core of the Carolingian, and the Carolingian residences were scattered in today's area of today's would be the Ile-de-France or northern France or Belgium. So that was essentially the core of the Carolingian domains proper. But also in here the kings moved. That they had this itinerant course as well, and and this was very important to reinforce the loyalty of the various populations by essentially always being in contact with them in a way or another. So mounted combat was a necessity at this point, to have a reliable force of professionals. And this hard, robust body of heavy cavalry that basically made up the backbone of the Carolingian army, albeit it was an elite, both numerical and also in strengths. So there are scholars that argue that the increasing cavalry was, first of all, it was definitely, and this is obvious, it was very slow. This process really didn't start as a rationalized project that someone woke up one day in mind with and invented it and put it into practice. It was something that developed from sheer practice, as we were saying before, out of conveniency, out of pragmatic reasons, and it eventually developed through this. And especially the development of heavy cavalry is strictly related to the Vassalatic-Beneficiary system, and it's a consequence of it more than anything else. So it's at this time that the evolution is also pretty slow. Even the problem of the stirrup, the famous thing of what the stirrup invented, kind of produced the heavy cavalry in the Middle Age. No, really not. It was the other way around. It's this cavalrymen that basically evolved from these individualistic minded warriors of the migration era that put definitely a great emphasis on individual prowess, also as cavalrymen, but that didn't have much of a formation, cohesion, or training, into this body of intensely trained aristocrats who had a very high level of collective training and practice, and they were professionals of war, not warriors as, searching for their own glory or stuff. There were, of course, there was a lot of evidence of that still remaining in it, but it was something much more organized, and that encompassed, in this sense, a very different society from the tribal one, but a feudal society that is essentially a highly stratified, organized, and directed society that practically revolves around this elite and makes of this system basically the raison d'être of the same. It's this is how feudal Europe really was born. Definitely at this time there was maybe of a tactical reason for which the cavalry also increased, and people have said, well, if you look at the enemies of the Franks at this point, there were peoples that had usually, especially fast-moving cavalries, and had and were especially also pretty speedy at a strategical level. So the cavalry here was both needed to be dealt with from a tactical point of view on the field with other cavalry, and at the same time from a strategical point of view, the Carolingian armies needed to be increasingly speedier, and therefore cavalry was the answer also in this. This is kind of, it's a good reason for that, although not all, if you look at the, of course, the enemies of the Carolingians this time, if you look at the Avars, the Arabs, the Vikings, the Longobards, and the Magyars, were kind of cavalry oriented by certain standards, but not excessively more than much. I believe that really the transformation occurred really within Frankish society, and mostly due to this quick response needs that would have happened also if the enemies had been of different nature. The Avars at this time especially were practically declining, and that's why the Carolingians made it to wipe them out. They put up an exceptional expedition actually against them that especially shows the logistical advancement of the Carolingians that is often overlooked, at least by someone. The Arabs at this point, they had largely mounted armies, but they still had infantry, so you can't really say it was extremely speedy armies. I mean, also this is a pretty mechanicistic idea. Also, cavalry is not necessarily this so speedy as you might think. I mean, one thing is having a Mongol army that is mounted on special breeds that are able to go for thousands of kilometers, etc. Armies in Western Europe, it doesn't, even if mounted, did not necessarily have this enormous speed, because even if you take the logistical needs, the cards, and still you have to have infantry together with you, so it's not this enormous speed that is gained by having more cavalry in the army as you may think. It's kind of speedier to have small bodies of cavalry that can, an elite cavalry that maybe has also a quite developed local organization to be sustained and fed, that really makes practically the difference. So I'm not a huge fan of this interpretation. The Vikings, they were largely foot armies, although recently it's been actually showed how important cavalry was to Viking armies as well, and definitely the Vikings relied on this kind of blitzkrieg, because they recognized the threat that a Carolingian army could pose at that time, because never forget that the Carolingians at this point were kind of the professionals of war of Europe. They weren't really some weird guys the Vikings wanted to attack for no reason. The Vikings feared the Carolingians, and they kind of tried to beat them by essentially moving speedily, raiding fast, and essentially coming back. The Longobards in origin had an extremely strong cavalry, but we're talking about the full migration era. At this point, really, the Longobards had fully essentially diluted into the Italian population. They hadn't had many reasons to continue practice essentially mounted combat at a professional level. Especially the Longobards didn't had a very few professional troops. It was only the Franks at this point that had invented this system of having such large bodies of professionals that made up a highly trained army, and also they had the resources to field such troops that were always a few, generally speaking, but they still were much more than what any other people could field in terms of strictly professional military. So even the Longobards, as far as we know, didn't have this hugely advanced army that we think. Probably a Frankish cavalryman and a Longobard cavalryman at this time were pretty similar, even in equipment. There wasn't a substantial difference in material, culture, for instance, or not even in equipment. The only problem is that it was about the organization. The Longobards didn't have a feudal system. They had this kind of local elite, especially urban elites, but even the same Longobard king could have much less land than a Carolingian vassal, where the Carolingian vassal could train and have military retinues, and this is something that in Gaul had already existed since the late antique compared to Italy. So the Longobards could surely field very good individual warriors, but were much less organized, and by the way also much less powerful as an entity. I mean, the Carolingian Empire was huge. The Longobard Kingdom was just like the Po Valley and Tuscany and a few other lands. I mean, it was just a tiny bit. So probably also in here, the Longobards do not have to be overlooked or underestimated. Simply that at this point in history was really the Carolingians were the exception. So it was not a matter of the others of being weak. It was about the Carolingians being this monstrous giant. It was as a political and social system completely oriented towards war, and in carrying out annually, so continuously, these military expeditions aimed at crushing people after people. So even then there were the Magyars. The Magyars start to appear actually at the end of the Carolingian times, let's say complexively, and these were the only truly all-mounted enemies that the Carolingians ever faced. And you can argue that definitely the importance of cavalry rose also in areas frontier, like in Germany during the 9th and the 10th century, because of dealing with the Magyar threat. That, by the way, the Ottonians would be able to really to eradicate at a point. After long struggles, and only after having put together some kind of military organization, at least in the Eastern Francia, eventually in the day. So my opinion is really that it wasn't much of a matter of the enemies that the Carolingians fought, but really broader strategical reasons that brought to, and also strictly political reasons and social reasons that brought to the rise of the Carolingian cavalry, and so that it has much deeper roots than just, okay, it's because the Franks fought against enemies that had mounted contingents. It is surely a factor, but it's not really the core of it. It's not really the essential reason. So towards as we were saying before, towards the end of the Carolingian times, cavalry continued to gain steam, essentially, and this happened also in here for many reasons. It was still a largely militarized military society. The Franks began essentially to clash one against the other, interestingly enough. So you had, like in many times in history, we want to stress the fact that these empires crumbled because they were aggressed from the exterior. No, even if you look, the Franks at this time had the greatest foe, the strongest foe the Franks could fight against at this time were other Franks. It was a bit like the Romans, when they're defeated at Adrianople by the Goths. everybody said, "Oh my God, this brought such a decline. It was such a watershed and all." If you see the Romans, after a few decades, were fighting against each other with much more massive armies that the Goths had been, and at that time arguably it was not a stronger army than the Roman ones, against which the Romans found the resources to fight against by killing each other in a civil war. So the Franks did essentially the same. There are these huge bloodbaths. If you think about the Battle of Fontenoy, that followed the civil strife between, by the way, the same Carolingian siblings practically, because that was about it. And the numbers of these armies was actually pretty massive, given the scanty evidence we have that obviously can be overly exaggerated, but just for saying that these civil wars saw a pretty high participation of the Frankish freemen and aristocracy that evidently thought that through these wars could achieve more by seizing, essentially by knocking out another part of the aristocracy and taking its place. So this naturally had a detrimental effect on the unity of the Carolingian Empire, and that's what brought first to the split of the Carolingian Empire and then eventually its collapse. At this point, the Franks hired, for instance, Vikings to fight against one another and to send Vikings raiding in the lands of their Frankish, their own Frankish neighbors. So it was a very complicated even period to explain. I will do it in another dedicated video on the topic, but just for saying that the level of militarism in the empire really didn't collapse over time. I mean, the collapse of the Carolingian Empire arguably brought to a higher degree of militarism within the same Frankish society, thanks to the rise of these aristocracies, so that while central authority was collapsing, they could gain more space in there, and then eventually grew to be so, and creating in the following centuries this military class that we know as the knights, essentially the milites, that had this very strong warlike ethos, and they built up essentially chivalry as we know it, as a political and military system, and a social system as well. It was all based on this mounted combat, and these seigneurial armies with military retinues were also mounted as well. And we have seen recently I made a video on the Capitulary of Pistre that deals with Charles the Bald attempt to essentially provide for the video was actually based for observing how they tried to stem the construction of spontaneous castles into Western Francia, but it also deals with the problem of the Viking threats and this attempt of militarization of society by, not really militarization of society, but of, trying to hire mounted not hire, to mobilize a large part of the Frankish freemen's population, so that every Frankish freeman that owned a horse was theoretically obliged to participate to the army. And this shows essentially also the increase into mounted combat at the time, as this edict was essentially trying to build an all-mounted force, so that could be a sort of quick reaction force towards the external threats, in that case in Western Francia mostly the Vikings, but in this sense was taking into consideration a situation that already existed de facto. The problem was not having mounted fighters. The problem was trying to make them fight for the royal power. So it was an attempt of also of centralization, for which it asked every single freeman to go fight for the king, and not instead to participate into these extremely violent and chaotic and activities that were actually entailing the construction of private lordships all over the territory, and the constructions of castles, and the oppression of the local communities. That was seen definitely as, rightfully, as a disruptive force, a disruptive factor for the centralization, from keeping at least alive the central power. And eventually we know that this central power vanished in the air because of this very reason. And there is a chronicle of 891 who claims that at this point the Franks did not even know anymore how to fight on foot, and this is naturally an exaggeration, but at the same time it shows, even from a cultural point of view, how much the Franks at this point consider themselves as chiefly as mounted fighters. This is very interesting because traditionally the Franks had been, perhaps with the only exception of the Anglo-Saxons or the Saxons, the continental Saxons, the Germanic population that made, and also the Scandinavians by the way, that made the least use of mounted troops during the migration era. At this time, even in Carolingian times, during the 8th century, the Visigoths and the Longobards were regarded by the same Franks traditionally as kind of honorary cavalrymen because of their ancient tradition of horsemanship, and this was claimed by the same Frankish sources, but maybe we will discuss this one at one point. But at this point, telling the truth, the Visigoths, and especially the Longobards, were not extremely good cavalrymen anymore. Their aristocracies had kind of gentrified. They still maintained the ideal of the mounted cavalryman, of the lord, of the Germanic warrior, etc., but their societies had really deeply transformed into something different. It had it was even a positive process, because they had civilized, they had developed, especially in Longobard Italy, they had developed very strong public systems, and which were unknown by the Franks. In fact, the Carolingians were extremely fascinated with Longobard Italy because they imported it presented a much more centralized model compared to their own. They tried also to partially export it, as in Francia, but failing, because, as we were saying before, there weren't the premises. But at that point, instead, the cavalry that was really rising to be the leading one in Europe was the one of the same Franks. And so at the end of, more than 1 century later, at the end of the 9th century, the consequence was that the Franks deemed themselves to be even incapable of fighting on foot anymore. And if you take, I don't know, the Battle of Poitiers, for instance, 732, or you realize, however, that still at the beginning of Carolingian times, in early Carolingian times, say better, the Franks had both already strong cavalry and strong infantry. So this is probably due to the degree of militarization that existed into Frankish Gaul already from the clashes that had occurred between these various chunks of the Merovingian kingdom that had been fighting against each other, and generally speaking, also the rise of the Carolingian that brought to this new fresh reorganization. And since the very beginning, by the way, the Carolingians, as we were saying, emerged from the Austrasian aristocracies. They came from the very eastern border of the empire, the tormented Saxon border. That's so always a lot of warfare going on, these continuous raids from the side of the Saxons and these responses from the side of the Franks. So the Carolingians had also very arguably a much more warlike mentality in origin than what the Frankish average was by the end of the 7th and beginning of the 8th century. So this was a factor also that has to be taken into consideration to understanding also the military prowess of these fighters. I mean, if you take Pippin, the second and Pippin, the third, or Charlemagne, I mean, these were all great commanders. We can't talk about military geniuses because, by the way, first of all, to be a military genius, you have to be in a condition that makes you prove to be a military genius. At this point, tactics and war weren't really something so overly complex for us to say, okay, well, this guy, look at how genial he was. But the Carolingians were great individual fighters, surely, because the Franks had still this individual ethos as warriors, and they would keep like that. I mean, these kings really fought into the battles. They followed, they led the campaigns themselves. But so they were great commanders indeed. But more than else, these were great organizers. They had a great, Charlemagne especially had a huge logistical talent. Was one of the greater commanders of his times. However, the idea is, because you see, also another problem here are the sources. We don't clearly know how, we can't understand there was a progressive increase in mounted combat, but we can't fully say, okay, we can't really measure it quantitatively, and a general tendency we have is to underestimate even the military quality of early medieval times by saying, okay, these weren't really, they didn't have training, they didn't have discipline. But even if you look at early Carolingian times, so even before the full development of the Vassalatic-Beneficiary system and before the height of the empire, you realize these clienteles there in Gaul were pretty much warlike. They pretty had a substantial quality. So never underestimate them. Never compare things that are not comparable. Just look at what they were capable to do in that specific context with the resources they had. Also, there is this prejudice saying, the Carolingian armies didn't have a great organization. They didn't have great logistics. What? What? Study, please, the campaigns against the Avars. Study the campaigns against the Longobards, and look at what it meant. Think of the means of those times to organize what it took to organize such campaigns, and then go tell me that the Franks didn't have a good logistics, they didn't have a good organization to switch thousands, to shift thousands of troops from in thousands of kilometers back and forth in Europe, all over Europe every year, and they didn't have a logistical talent. Are you kidding me? Do you understand how it takes to move such armies? Do you know what the economical potential was at that time? These guys had an enormously developed logistic and organizational system, and arguably this was the greatest element of the Frankish military, even before then cavalry. Because cavalry, it kind of evolved over time. You can't compare Carolingian cavalry with, 13th century cavalry. It was obviously was less developed, and it began in Carolingian times in the fashion but also here was very progressive. It's mostly the organizational skills of the Franks that are amazing. And that, by the way, prove one thing that I'm deeply convinced of, is that and that you can see also in many other occasions in military history, that as long as that you don't have to be tricked by political fragmentation as a factor of individual weakness. If anything, it's the other way around, because you see that as long as there were the premises for building these huge powers like the Carolingian one was, doesn't matter how quickly it fell eventually. The military organization was actually extremely dynamic. Even this idea that, I don't know, in medieval times armies were they didn't travel more than much. They were difficult to move logistically, but I think just the Carolingian times weren't even the most developed of the Middle Ages, and go tell me that you couldn't shift soldiers like that. It's humans always know how to organize warfare given such premises. They always know how to move. Think about, I don't know, the First Crusade. What did Godfrey of Bouillon knew about Syria or Palestine? As far as I don't know, he probably didn't travel much out of Belgium and France itself. They were able to mount a perfect expedition in the allegedly backwards medieval world that made it to go from Northern Europe to Palestine and to conquer one of the most fortified, one of the largest cities at the time. So how could it be that these guys were not organized or backwards, or they didn't have an efficient logistics? These guys knew perfectly how to do that. All they lacked was the amount of resources, but given those resources when they were available, they proved they could do everything. And this is how valid also in the Carolingian Empire, with something astonishing. And naturally also in here there were many reasons for which the Carolingian Empire existed, and it might have not existed actually, not even the time of it would have just taken, I don't know, Charlemagne not to have, obviously not he had necessarily died, but just even take if his brother had not died, Carloman had not died. Did the Franks would have kept spending their time killing against each other, they would haven't had the opportunity to create the empire as Charlemagne eventually could do. So very, let's say, even random factors that brought to the ascent of these empires that obviously shows that eventually if this empire were able to move such huge armies, and for that time for those time standards, and to put them in motion, etc., it wasn't just a random factor. It was really a structural factor that was definitely exploitable as soon as the conditions were favorable to exploit it. So this is very important in my opinion to stress. So as we were saying, the backbone of the Carolingian army was made up by these landowners or vassals that were in fact nothing new, as we've seen in the clientelarly society of Western Europe, but at this time were entrusted much more land and therefore being able to provide much stronger military retinues. So there was an equivalency. There was, how much did these landowners have to provide for war? Essentially, there were these units of measure of the land that were the mansi. So the mansis could actually vary in size. They weren't actually the same. They were more the name given to the unit as such, that rather quantifying the measure of the unit in itself. So the mansi could really vary. Usually a freeman who basically the service, especially in later Carolingian times, was owed by any freeman who owned at least 4 months of land. And this it doesn't matter whether these mansi were held in full property or if instead were given as a benefice, as a beneficium by the king. So as long as you owned or you administered this number of this quantity of land, you had to provide such you had to go either to war or to pay essentially for the equivalent of your service. the so there were also naturally other ways of other levy systems at this point that were also negotiated with the local communities, so it wasn't so standardly organized. But let's say that the royal vassals, that were the cavalrymen of the Carolingian army, were the bulk of the army, were known as the Cavalry, and made up this core of the army, really the one that had to be more readily functional. For the other subjects, usually it was a bit different. The thing could be organized in a way. It was initially the ancient Germanic Heerbahn, so this call for the army that was owed as even not just as a duty, but even as a privilege of the Germanic freemen. And this is something that actually lasted pretty late, even into the feudal world, especially in certain more Germanic areas. So there was this practice that incidentally I discussed for the late Roman army just recently in the video called Fiscal Recruitment in the Late Roman Army. That was this consortium that was actually the Carolingian military system was pretty similar to the Roman one, but not because it was directly influenced. It's because it was like the elementary way to do it. You know, it was based on property. As long as you were a subject, a freeman who owned a certain amount of wealth, you had to participate to the army, especially in the in the Central European world, so in the lands of north of the Alps, there was a very few. Really, the base was the land. Money, there were surely merchants who had lots of properties and all this stuff, but it wasn't so common. So especially in there, the standard was really owning the land. For instance, the system of recruitment in Italy was different, because this was inherited by the Carolingians from the Longobards. The army had to be, the wealthy citizens, like the merchants, not citizens, sorry, the wealthy subjects, like the merchants, etc., had to contribute to the army, given their wealth, with the equivalent of a certain amount of land that was, however, counted also in a sense could be commutated also with money. So in those areas of the empire where the local trade or financial activities were more developed, it wasn't anymore a matter of owning land, but also owning money, coins, other goods that could make you eligible for the service. So as we were saying, every freeman who had enough at least four mansi, so this unit of land, had to contribute to the army. If the smaller owners, so people who owned less than 4 mansi, had to consortiate together and provide, to put up, to organize into 4 mansi altogether. To put, I don't know how to say this. Sorry, today I'm really tired. They had to reach, however, the equivalent of 4 mansi and send, in this sense, one man to the army. So there were several combinations. This could be really combined in many ways. You could be 2 owners that owned 2 men who owned 2 months for each, or maybe just one. Maybe one person who owned 3 months and another one with only 1, or 4 men with 1 month each. So this could really be it, as long as they formed up this consortium that could provide for 1 man or more. Definitely, we can imagine that we're much in the practice, given that our sources are very scanty, more complex ways to combine these properties for the army and for the recruitment. Sorry. So there was of these consortiates, of these landowners, only one had to provide to provide physically for the recruitment. That could be because theoretically also, I'm sorry, I'm making a bit of a, not a mess, but it's difficult to explain. I mean, one person had to be recruited every 4 months, okay? So together with the person, there had to be also equipment and rations to be provided, so to be supplied, and these were generally supplied by the people who remained at home, of these owners that had contributed to the consortium and that were essentially paying for this. The owner who had not just to pay his own share, but also, I mean, when this cycle essentially changed, because this was usually meant to work cyclically, that of these, say, if there were 4 people every year, it was there was a rotation for which the person who had gone once didn't have to go the second time. This could be really changed in practice. Because sometimes were also people who essentially went to war, or the important was to really to provide the person who would go to war. So it didn't matter whether the person who was supplied for the service was one of the owners. They could also find someone else who, for some reason, was offered himself to go to war, and for which these owners had to for whose equipment and rations these owners had to pay. So this could be a very big expense, because actually most of these recruits had to serve on horse. This, however, was there was a gradation into this. Usually, in these forms of levy had existed also in previous times in the Latin Germanic world, and they entailed that, according to the person's wealth, theoretically every freeman had to participate, and only the wealthiest guys had to provide a horse, while the others just other kind of to provide a horse and equipment, so weapons, and all others had just to provide weapons and not a horse. Others had to provide other lesser weapons and so on. It is actually remained at the base of the recruitment system all over Europe, also in later times. So if you look at the Seas of Arms, for instance, of England, I made a video also on that. This was pretty normal. Usually the top class was to provide a heavy cavalryman. The lowest class had to join with, I don't know, bow and arrows, usually. So there was a lot of difference in this sense, but seemingly the Carolingians were more interested in actually having troops that were more functional to their strategical goals. So they definitely recruited infantrymen as well as horsemen, but horsemen had were definitely more needed by the Carolingians, were probably also preferred in some way. Also because this had also consequences at the local level. Even if it could be really equivalent by certain standards, taking away manpower from the local land is not really a great idea. I mean, sometimes it's more, especially for the agricultural production, sometimes it's better for these people to pay to send just a minor portion of the population to fight, maybe even providing a horse, but letting enough people at home to keep working the land, for instance, so that the system had also the ability of regenerating resources that were and these resources spent for war were definitely pretty high. So these mass levies of untrained troops that had just to make mass weren't really a big help, especially logistically speaking, for the Carolingian armies, that were not really preferred. So that's also a reason why the mounted elite was at this point so successful, because there was also a more pragmatic look at the whole society's commitment, I think. Also because we have said that Frankish Gaul was pretty much stratified socially already at this point. So the idea is how many people were there that could make for good fighters at a middle class or even lower class level. In order to have a good fighter as an individual, it has to be trained. It already has to have a certain warrior mindset. Indeed, if we look maybe eastwards towards Eastern Francia, maybe we see that in there the tribal military ethos had remained a little more. So maybe the average Eastern Frankish freeman was a bit more warlike, a bit more valid in military terms than, I don't know, the average Western Frankish subject, for instance, freeman. But this is not really a speculation. This is probably it. But just for saying that at that point it was more advantageous, more profitable to draw money, or that could serve to pay other troops from a certain community than rather forcing the whole population to join. I mean, the whole class of male freemen to join the war, because also logistically speaking you have to feed these people. So that's a problem. One thing is feeding a guy who already knows what to do because he's already trained and all, and one thing is feeding masses of no ones that really don't have a great military quality, and they're just gonna inflate your logistical expenses and increase attrition and all these problems. So the Carolingians were really keen on this. I mean, few but good. Even though Carolingian armies were actually pretty large, this is also another problem. However, the important thing is that this monthly system of recruitment wasn't substantially different from how the rest of the world was functioning in terms of military service. If you look at the Anglo-Saxon field, where it basically worked in the same exact fashion, it was based on the Mansi unit of measure of the land. It was to provide this, and this had been, the standard all over Europe at this point. It was used it had been used in the Byzantine Empire, had been used now, and in an essentially agricultural world, the mansus as a unit of land was definitely the most practical patrimonial point of reference from a quantitative point of view. By the 9th century, however, by the the beginning of the 9th century, the end of the 8th, the beginning of the 9th century, it seems that the Carolingians were trying to extend, as we were saying before, a little more the military service to a greater amount of the population. This, in my opinion, has to be interpreted for providing military service at a local level, not necessarily to participate to the army, to the mobile army of the great expeditions, etc. And also in here there were different combinations, and it's kind of senseless to list, because it's just how these landowners could combine their own wealth to provide the required quota of troops and equipment and supplies. So at this point there were variations also relatively to the service, because this was still technically meant to join the army, but these requirements, this recruitment, also took into consideration where these guys had to be sent. For instance, into Saxony, into Frankish Saxony, the Saxons had been conquered. Now the Saxons were used also in the army, in the Carolingian army, because they were forced to participate. And this is interesting because it says that the Saxons were expected to field, by the way. So just even think about the organizational problems at the time with communications of the time, the absence of a bureaucracy, of a control. I mean, so there is a great debate whether this system actually, what could this system really provide. So even the capitularies we have that say that every, a man every 6 or every 3 or had to be sent to war from a certain population, was probably just a desperate request that was already taking into account the chance of not being met practically. So, but this was still issued, because eventually there was also a problem of having manpower, in the sense of getting manpower in recruitment and so on. But nevertheless, these laws are interesting, because in the case of the Saxons, it says that the Saxon community is expected to field 1 man in 6 against the Arabs and the Avars, 1 man in 3 against the Bohemians, or every man against the Wends and the Sorbs across the Elbe. Now, you understand there is evidently a geographical reasons for this demand. Now, the Arabs and the Avars were relatively far from Saxony. At least, obviously, the Arabs were now to be found on the southwestern frontier of the empire, was pretty far from Saxony. The land of the Avars, not so much, but it was still pretty far away. I mean, it was essentially the Saxons that had to cross the wall of Germany to go fight against the Avars. So it was requested just 1 man over 6. That is already not a few, telling the truth. Then it says 1 man over 3 against the Bohemians. So the Bohemians here are closer, and therefore the Saxons are expected to provide more easily troops to reach Bohemia, to go fight in there. And basically every able-bodied freeman against the Wends and the Sorbs across the Elbe, so just on the same Saxon frontier in the east. So this is interesting because it takes into account the actual practicability of mobilizing the troops on the base of where they had to go fight, so that these ethnic contingents were meant to fight against in greater numbers against those peoples that were closer to them geographically. It kind of makes sense. Think about the logistics of that time. It was very tough, and it also costed a lot. to move these men. Now we will also talk about the rations, the supplying system, because that is quite important. Considering that the supplies had to be provided also in part by the local by the same levies. Well, there's a huge difference in terms of costs if you have to provide your rations for going to fight against the Vends that are just next door, or if you have to fight the Arabs that are from the other side of Europe. So naturally also in here actually supplies were standardized. It was we'll see it was usually an amount of food that could last for 3 months that had to be provided by the levy. But these dispositions in here, this instructions, these regulations were evidently aimed also at a system that was surely much more complex. Also, telling the truth, in all military history, this problem of the rations and the equipment that has to be provided by the single privately, let's say by the single soldier, is always been kind of very theoretical. It's not. I think that at no time in history you have to imagine the guy really packing his stuff and bringing it to the army and kind of always bringing it with himself, and there was always a kind of a greater organization, so that this amount of levies and their equipment were actually raised by the local administration in certain amounts that were an equivalent to the material, that human and non-human material that was requested for the army. So everything was organized, and there were also many resources that eventually came from other sources. Just all that station systems that existed, that the vassals were owed to keeping fit, was eventually created for supporting these armies along the way. So to have this ready amount of resources that could be used for the army when passing along these stations to be fed, to be replenished, to be restocked, with provisions, supplies and all. And these stocks were very important because they were present all over the empire, and this is also very interesting because we don't know much about them, but we imagine they also contributed in part to that process that eventually followed later of the encapsulation. I mean, all these warehouses, they were probably also entrenched, they had fences at best, or were even fortified on some occasions, were very profitable centers of power as such. And eventually with the disgregation of the Carolingian Empire, they were surely seized by the local lords. So the administration, say the levies were commanded usually by local lords, especially if they attended this general levy of the Heerban, so that naturally there were forms of recruitment that are not showed in detail by the sources, that are quite pragmatic. If you read the Carolingian capitularies, they really get straight to the point. They don't waste much time into details, unfortunately. But as we were saying, as the Carolingian Empire was so diverse, culturally speaking, the communities were so they already had different ways of organizing themselves. If you read the Carolingian capitularies, you often find, especially in those lands that were a bit more advanced than the same Frankish ones, like to the Longobard Kingdom, that the Franks are explicitly saying in the law to the subjects to tell them how they were used to be organized, so that they observed that it was already a functioning system, and all they needed was to essentially let it in place, because if it was functional, there was no reason to take it away. So we can imagine various different types of levy systems of recruitment that corresponded to the various different communities that existed out there in the empire. So it would be normal for such ethnical contingents to be led by local aristocrats, local lords, as you want to call them. However, they were usually assigned by the Carolingian authorities. Usually these comites that were the comes was essentially the count that ruled in these. The Carolingian Empire was split in all these districts that were the counties, in fact, except the only one different was the mark that we'll see later. Was so the Markian ruled on the frontiers, and they had especially military functions. We'll see it now. So the whole empire was parceled into counties, and the local comes usually accompanied the army and led it. Accompanied the local contingent together with the local lords and the local levies, etc. Together, naturally, with his own retinue, because the comes was in this sense a vassal. It was like the standard vassal in Carolingian Europe that had his own military retinues that he drew from the benefices that he had got from the king. Naturally, the comites had also certain civil, not just military functions. Okay, so they were in charge of the whole situation. And you can imagine how this favored decentralization de facto, as well as it was, these counties that basically produced the decline of the empire in terms of, because they were kind of monads that kind of worked on their own in practice. So, well, the central authority collapsed, was usually this aristocracy that was remaining in charge. There was also a relatively to the strict organization of the army. We don't know. There was probably a decimal organization, but this could really vary, because the organic really varies wildly all over history. So here in the same places, and even in here, there weren't probably even certain standard units in terms of numbers. And theoretically probably yes, but we don't have any evidence, I think, or at least if we have, that could really vary wildly. And the service was owed for a certain amount of time, because the idea, even in the Carolingian Empire, was still very Germanic in at least in tradition. So the idea is that nobody could oblige the freeman to do something for to owe a service for for kind of a indeterminate, unspecified amount of time. So the service was usually 3 months. That is probably was naturally a compromise with local communities. I don't know how much this thing of 3 months was even standard already in the Frankish Gaul since the beginning of the Carolingian times. However, it probably corresponded to the idea of the good season. Probably usually in Northern Europe the campaigns started into May. It was really a problem of foraging, because in Southern Europe usually the war season began in March instead. So it would be essentially May, June, July, and already in August probably they came back home, because the weather kind of starts getting worse. It kind of makes sense. So this idea, however, this was just a standard measure, because telling the truth, this 3 months expedition could, first of all, it could expeditions could become longer, and we have evidence of this. But at the same time, these 3 months expeditions could be repeated during the same year, because there were situations, well, definitely of emergency, of particular intense problem that obliged the Carolingians to ask the communities for multiple expeditions, even during the same year. Naturally, this augments the rise of professionalism, because the average no one that is brought there to fight with his own provisions, theoretically, with his own little sack, tray with bread and this, cannot stay for even 3 months realistically on a campaign. So if you have such an intense military service, you need to be someone who you need to have more resources, and that's the reason why the Vassalatic-Beneficiary system was created, to provide a professional army that could last longer on the field. Obviously, also the professionists had their own limits, also because there was not just a material cost but also a political cost to it, because stressing too much the same clients wasn't definitely couldn't generate problems of sorts. But it's important because, as many other armies in the time, you realize that professionalism is something that emerges when war ceases to remain framed into the seasonal time limits. For instance, when Charlemagne invaded Italy, he besieged. That was a huge operation. It was probably one of the most important, because the Franks had to cross the Alps, and Charlemagne actually divided this 2 major big columns to pass the Alps into different places, so obliging the Longobards from the other side to split their forces as well. He crushed the Longobard army into the Alpine foothills, and he pushed towards Pavia. It was the capital of the Longobard kingdom. Now, the siege of Pavia lasted for 9 months, and no other siege in the Carolingian history lasted more, because Pavia was, in this sense, in the Italian environment, one of these still. It was a Roman city, essentially. It was fortified. It was a very strong center. So in here, the Carolingians show all their logistical power. They're able to besiege the city for 9 months and to oblige it to capitulate in the end. And after that, they seized more or less the whole Longobard kingdom. I mean, 9 months. This requires in a foreign land and across the Alps, and think even. In fact, during the winter. So think of the resources that the Carolingians were able to mount up for an expedition like that, and to make it. So this is really really important. There were also limits. So obviously it is limits of 9 months, or the 40, and the 9 months was evidently not met, and we don't practically know which kind of troops Charlemagne used at this point. Obviously, his army was still made up by wasn't probably that different from. You can imagine also there was a big deal of foraging in the meanwhile, of devastations, because just to feed this army. But it's pretty obvious that you can't do that with simple levies, because they're gonna simply run away. So you need to organize something more stable that is also able to provide especially supplies, because that's the point. As long as you keep these men fed and safe, you can't hope them to remain to the field. If you don't have that, if you don't have a logistics that functions, you can't go much away. In the first half of the 9th century, Louis the Pious was he established that basically, so this thing of reiterating, say, or repeating the expeditions during the same year had brought Louis the Pious to specify in the laws that in order to be obliged to serve, a subject had to had at least 40 days of, say, of rest between each period of service. So this evidently corresponds to also to certain problems that, because when you read the these Frankish laws, but as arguably when you read every kind of law in history, and medieval laws are beautiful to read, you understand that we're responding very pragmatic reasons. So these weren't laws that were invented by someone just for no reason, just for, aesthetics. They responded to very concrete problems. The Franks, as we were saying before, were extremely pragmatic people. They didn't have a great ability of construction of very complex. They wanted things to get done, and therefore, if there was such a regulation was specified to wait at least 40 days between an expedition to another, evidently someone had definitely complained about the intensity of the service, and this meant, by the way, that up to that point, this kind of prolonged service had been evidently enforced effectively by a certain degree. So it was basically central authority was granting something to these peoples, and this is interesting because it stresses how, in order to have such continuous military activity, there had to be a logistical organization that was able to sustain armies for such a prolonged time on the field or wherever, or even along the way. Because, by the way, think even about the time that it took to get across Europe. That is something often overlooked. There are beautiful sources that tell us these Carolingian armies, or rather than Carolingian armies, the single contingents that were sent eventually to rally at a certain point, usually on the war zone, on the frontier, from all the corners of the empire. So, getrennt marschieren, vereint schlagen. That it means, march, divided, and hit, and united. And this was the concept. It was much easier to entrust and that's why these vassals, why the Vassalatic-Beneficiary system was so decentralized, because it was also easier to control in this sense. You didn't have to collect every single contingent from all over the corners of the empire, making this kind of never-ending travel across Europe. You basically only issued these guys to get at a certain point of the year on that place to gather in there, and then from there to move eventually into the theater of operations. Naturally, you can imagine this was also very much mediated. I mean, every single vassal was kind of asked for it, and it could have been ready, could have not been ready. There was also the problem of replacement of the vassals, because part of them objectively died during the campaigns, or they died simply because of natural causes. So think about how difficult it was to manage this whole ensemble. Probably there were certain things that were even kind of untold. I mean, there wasn't even maybe a singular request, but I mean, news traveled fast. The problem was to actually put these guys together, and this was arguably the most difficult thing to do, which the Carolingians, however, succeeded in doing with great difficulties, with great even we see it from the laws. We've said it before. It was difficult to put a lot of people together in this sense, but it worked. And we have these beautiful laws that tell us, I don't know, that a single bishop or abbot or commis or even an abbess had to send these contingents, sometimes thousands of kilometers across Europe. There is a beautiful a beautiful source about I think it was the abbot of Saint-Vendry. So this place it's close to Paris, and that was issued by the king, by Charlemagne in 806 to reach Strasbourg, that is in today's Sachsen-Anhalt in eastern Germany. So this meant the guy had to provide, first of all, he had to provide, this had to cross more or less 1,000 kilometers. Today it's 900 kilometers with our own roads. At the time was considerably more. So think of all the stops, of all the problems. You have to get across half of Europe to make this pass. So the abbot of Saint-Vendry had 4,278 mansi, and he had to provide hence, given the at the time was one man every 5 mansi, roughly 850 men, which is not a huge number, but it's still a pretty consistent one. Just think at how much calories it takes to shift 850 men, their equipment, their food, their supplies for 1,000 kilometers, and how much time it takes. And so basically it's been calculated only to do this. The abbot would need something like 70,000 kilos, so 75 tons of material to carry this thing. Figure about all the carts, all the draught animals. This is something amazing. And a column of 850 men takes like 2 kilometers on the road to deploy in order to march. Also because these roads weren't in Central Europe anything developed at the time. So Charles the Great at one point managed to move even up to 50,000 men on campaign. That is a logistic miracle. So don't come tell me that Carolingians didn't have a great logistics, because it's plain rubbish, historically speaking. Okay, there is, telling the truth, a lot of debate about the actual numbers of how these Carolingian armies really were. There is a tendency to downsize everything, even at the point of certain authors think that the Carolingian armies were rarely more than some thousands when there were the big expeditions. It's probably true. Probably there weren't. But first of all, now I won't stop explaining why, but it's extremely complicated to even assess this. And in my opinion, it's not so strange that even tens of thousands could have existed. Like the maximum possible was 50,000. Really, for the technology of that time, it was impossible to manage more than 50,000 men at once in a military campaign. But even if they made it, I just think first, which I'm positive about. Obviously, 50,000 is really, it can be considered as an exaggeration, but it's still plausible at least. Just think of the sheer amount of resources. We're talking about actually thousands of tons of material. These guys were able to put it in motion in 9th century Europe. Chapeau, really. These were amazing. And the Franks were like, they're my myth. They're my heroes, logistically speaking, because if you think about it, every kind of army had this kind of ability, telling the truth, but it sickens me when I hear people that say that in the Middle Ages nothing worked, etc. Well, because it's so stupid. One thing is the availability of resources. Another thing is the ability of using those resources. It's mostly the lack of the first that causes that during the Middle Ages, usually campaigns were smaller. In the case of the Carolingian, this proves that when resources were available to such a large empire, things could be put in motion, and even pretty well. So, oh my god, we have still so many things to say. So, talking about vassals, they had probably a sort of retinue that included their tenants. He probably, vassals usually already had these military retinues that were something more than just the issued levies to be supplied to the army. They probably had already these kind of bands of thugs that would eventually emerge as the familia, the masnata, as it was called in Latin at the time, is basically the retinue of these local lords. These were probably also mounted, so they were the core of the same the bodyguard, let's say, of the same vassal. But from the capitularies, actually, we have a very few evidence of them. At least there is no mention of it, because, as we were saying before, the capitularies don't really waste much time to specify things that were already normal and happening by themselves, autonomously. So the capitularies were just aimed at making something work. There was no need to add else. They were not conceived, unfortunately, for us to understand that world 1,000 and more years later. So there were naturally, we have to imagine, around these local contingents that were provided by the counts to the comites, also some, I can't say permanent troops, but I mean people who were kind of dealing with the wall, the organization of the wall, and not just from a sheer logistical point of view, but also maybe more special light units used, for instance, for scouting, for even outflanking the enemy. I mean, troops that kind of were starting to make a living out of war by, in this sense, assisting the local count and working for him. In this sense, being say, richly handsomely rewarded. So this naturally increased also the quality. These kind of local personal interests increased the commitment of these elements, and we have the evidence of this of such units that were called the scare in Latin. It comes from the Germanic schar, which means nothing but essentially rank. So it's the meant as really the formation more than else. So they will scare, so these guys were called scaramanni in Latin. So the man of this scaras, it would literally be, and these were kind of also scariti homines, escaricati in Latin. So these were troops that kind of pop out here and there in the sources, and we don't clearly know what they were, but they seemingly had this kind of elite role in the battle. Similar peoples had something similar, perhaps. For instance, from the Longobard kingdom, the Carolingians record certain Gazindi that were called like that in the they had similar roles, and also in there they weren't. These don't have to be meant as pure professionals of war. Sometimes they were kind of I don't know how to say that. Certain say local aristocrats. Sometimes people who were pretty much the factota of the local commerce. These people also had a very special medium that made up this very special medium between the Carolingian administration and the local communities that organized the things, that had were also politically influent and so on. So we have to imagine it not necessarily in a strictly military role, but also in something more complex that entails the relation between the Carolingians and the subjected peoples. And some suggest that the same royal or imperial bodyguards of the Carolingians were conceived as scare themselves, although I'm not sure about this. I should check better, but I don't think there is no certainty at all because it's too complicated. But it doesn't even matter. I mean, these were names just used, and Skara is not the name of a category of troops. It's just a name that is given to, I mean, like that, without any scientifical character, you know. And we have to consider case by case what it practically means. Relatively to the rations we were talking about before, usually the 3 months expedition was meant going in parallel with the duty to carry for each single levy to carry enough rations for 3 months. This naturally could vary on the basis of how far they had to travel. Interestingly enough, the arms and clothing had to instead last for some 6 months, because, by the way, think of when you are on campaign, your clothes, you're not gonna have your clothes for, I think, already after a pair of months. This is something we can see for much more recent times. Things get perished very, very easily. And this is very interesting because it really gives you, I mean, this difference of 3 months for durations and 6 months for arms and clothing obviously shows you that unless you didn't want the soldiers to starve, there was a centralized system of some kind that provided for the troops nutrition for those extra 3 months. So we have seen how it happened. You have to imagine also not just a centralized system, but also a lot of ravaging, of looting, of loot and so on. So this entailed, in part, that if these 3 months rations were objectively and optimistically already available at the beginning of the campaign, however, that after 3 months, or whatever was the time, these rations would have been exhausted. So this posed a very big logistical problem, because naturally the army has to be fed, otherwise it melts away. So this is also probably a bit theoretical, because we have seen there were other ways through which the Carolingian organization could be, military organization could feed the soldiers, but it still was a very big problem for those times in logistical terms. When you see this especially when the Carolingian Empire splits into several parts, and you see, for instance, the campaigns of Ludwig II into Italy against the Saracens or against other peoples. They were very difficult to mount up. First of all, because the resources were probably scanty, but also the terrain was pretty harsh, especially in central and southern Italy. And you see that the main failure of these campaigns was mainly logistical. Scorched and politics was pretty much easy to carry out, and to wear out an enemy at that time was pretty much easy, as naturally the energetic or technological potential was pretty low, so it was easy for the nature herself to wear out the enemy and just letting the enemy letting you wait for it to happen in a certain sense. So great success of the Carolingian military expeditions have to be understood also by the huge amount of resources that existed that were in the hands of the dynasty when the empire was still united, especially these vast, extremely fertile areas of the Atlantic plains of France that were extremely productive, agriculturally speaking. And it's no surprise that the core of the Carolingian lands was essentially in northeastern France, in Belgium, that were extremely fertile areas that were organized eventually to become the same cradle of the feudal system for this very reason. And their aristocratic management, essentially. So naturally, you can imagine there were lots from the capillaries we get. There were lots of problems of discipline, as it was very difficult for the central authority to impose a rigid discipline to all these populations that were pretty diverse. Also, the actual authority, central authority, wasn't this enormously strong, so sometimes there were serious problems. Especially, there were also ideological problems, because the Carolingians at this point were also stressing very much the Christian nature of their empire. They had kind of reformed their clergy to purify it, to make it become ideal. They truly believed that their success as an empire was based on how truly Christian the empire was. So sometimes in the capitularies we find things like when for the these were the dispositions, the regulations of the army to reduce rapes and or burning churches or something like that when the Lent approaches. So you can imagine that these armies really, formally Christian armies, but they were pretty much interested in looting and even sacking these places like along the way, but even churches. So this is the crude reality of the world, and not just the medieval world, by the way. There was a need also to probably reduce the sheer numbers. I mean, to save some sort of space of also for controlling the soldiers, in this sense, to prevent them from looting along the way into friendly territory. It was easier to make them march in a single column, so the officers, the NCOs could look at if they could look at them better. Another problem here is where we have seen there were lots of mounted troops as well. So horses, as you know, have to eat and drink a freaking lot of stuff every day, and that was a huge logistical concern. So certain Carolingian expeditions were aborted eventually, especially because of the lack of forage for horses. So this is very important also in explaining sometimes the limits of the Carolingian expansion, because one thing is expanding in places like France that is already basically your courtyard, and there is also in organizational terms already many infrastructures. It's a fertile land. The society is already stratified in a fashion that is able to provide certain resources. One thing is to expand into the wilderness of populations that still do not know urbanism. They're still pagan, they live in forests, and it's very hard. If you look at the first campaigns of Charlemagne into Saxony, well, the ratio cost benefits was pretty in favor of the costs. They went there to lose overall. Then eventually they made it to, if you look at the thing on a longer in perspective, on a longer picture, on a longer term, you realize eventually by the beginning of the 9th century the Franks had managed to incorporate Saxony and to subdue it and to remain it, to conquer the whole Germany that way. But the single expeditions in this sense could be extremely costly enterprises, and this, by the way, tells you about how stubborn the Carolingians were and how clear they had in mind what was necessary to do. In the case of Saxony, it's pretty evident. They went there to lose initially, and they probably already knew that because they knew what the terrain was. The Franks knew perfectly the Saxons were kind of cousins in their way, but they kept doing it, and they obtained, in fact, on the long run, that Germany and Saxony especially was to become even the same cradle of the Holy Roman Empire as we mean it historiographically for later stages with the Ottonians, etc. So this is also another important part of the thing, to have a strategic vision, to be able to understand how things work. And so the Franks, now we talked about logistics first. Naturally, at this time the Franks developed also certain, I think, not maybe new type of chariots, but kind of implement their wagons. They could have a capacity of 12 bushels of corn, 12 small barrels of wine. There were many. We've seen hundreds, if not thousands, actually, in the largest Carolingian expeditions. So these the provisions mostly consisted in flour that can naturally be preserved easily, and you can make bread with that in many conditions. Wine is very important, also traditionally speaking, as to Germanic peoples. The Strategicon of the 6th century tells us that basically the Germans couldn't fight without a supply of wine. It kind of makes sense, because wine especially gives you this extra, before combat, gives you this immediate extra energy that is immediately burnt by the organism, so it's pretty useful. Port as well, corn meals and other rations, like plus and the weaponry too as well, that occupied a substantial volume as well. Axes, orgères, axes, and slings, staff slings actually, and these material was also entailed lots of people had to know how to take care of it, and such especially the indications such particular weaponry entailed that there were skilled, specialized operators to use these weapons. Other bullets, like, I don't know, stones for these slings, were carried by pack horses as well, and you can imagine all the, especially the tools for like spades, planes, boards, arch-shod stakes. These were mostly meant for the camp, for setting up the camp, and all the other weapons of sort, like spears, shields, bows, quivers, arrows. Think about the volume of all this stuff packed together. It's a huge, it's arguably naturally a burden. Not surprisingly, the Romans called these in Latin the impedimenta, because they practically made it difficult really to move, and they knew that. But as we've seen, part of the Carolingian military success was due to this extremely planned and organized logistics. So naturally, think of also the covers that existed on the wagons, especially the ones who carried the food provisions and all the stuff. So also methods of preserving food that we don't know excessively much about, but there was probably a great knowledge at the time, a very pragmatic way. So talking about the marches, known as marche or marche in Latin, these were differently from the counties, as we have seen, this border districts that were created expressly to defend the frontiers from the harassment of the external enemies. So these regions, there were equivalents. For instance, the Byzantine Empire had the themata that were organized in similar fashions, but here it's relatively something different. The Carolingian Empire had very tumultuous frontiers, so these were dotted all with fortresses that were also linked by roads to provide this mutual assistance to one with the other. And they were all, as a territory, they were practically organized also to assist logistically the offensive campaigns the Carolingians had to carry out in the bordering foreign bordering territory. So each these marches were all were ruled by a so-called marchio in Latin, or margrave, as it would remain, and they had, in this sense, a more intense process of feudalization in many ways. This happened for many reasons. First of all, the one was evidently the problem of having a force was combat ready at all time, with the base of the resources already available locally, with the beneficia already present along this frontier, so that the I don't know how the resources could be accessible just there. They didn't have to come from elsewhere. Secondly, I argue that definitely the outskirts of the empire at this point were also the least urbanized place. I mean, they were usually in areas that maybe the Carolingians had just conquered. For instance, the Eastern Mark, that had to become eventually Austria for this very reason. Austria maybe it's not the most brilliant examples, but let's say even the Mark on the Elbe River or on the northeastern Italy. I mean, those were areas that were traditionally all less urbanized than the average, that they were more easily, probably also already more fortified previously to the Carolingian conquest proper, and that were already organized in a certain fashion for war and had developed in a more military fashion by themselves. This was not true everywhere, especially in the regions were invaded by the Vikings, because actually the Vikings started pillaging the very heart of the Carolingian domains, so those weren't regions that had historically become particularly fortified, or let's say or that were conceived as a frontier, because piracy had been modest up to the end of the 8th century. So, and that's arguably the reason why the Vikings hit especially there, because they were extremely fertile areas, they were populated, rich, the core of the empire. Obviously there was an additional risk given and that the sources of Frankish manpower was closer, but hey, those were Vikings, and they thought they could make it, and in fact France especially was practically devastated by the Vikings in this sense. And what is interesting about this last thing is that these were maritime provinces, and that the military service that was owed by the local vassals for the providing the defense of these lands was sometimes demanded on shipboard. Yes, so the Franks also engaged into maritime warfare, into naval warfare against the Vikings sometimes. And this is interesting because the Romans, for instance, had done similar things against the Anglo-Saxon piracy back in the day into Britain, and the Franks were not a maritime power, definitely, but they kind of mounted up something. Their concerns were mostly terrestrial, but definitely the harassment of the Vikings from Denmark, they were starting to provide a serious problem. Arguably, telling the truth, the Franks had known a bit of Frisian piracy back in the day, so I don't know. The Franks also ideally they conceived themselves, especially the Salians, to have descended from their king from a maritime monster. I mean, the Merovingians believed this. So there's this kind of, I mean, back in the late Roman Empire, there was a lot of Frankish piracy, even in places you wouldn't expect, like the Black Sea or the Eastern Mediterranean. So the Franks had probably much more to do with the sea in origin, but they weren't so unaware of sea as. Naturally, we rightfully tend to picture the Carolingians as mainly a terrestrial power, in opposition with the Vikings, who were all about sea expeditions and all. But there were certain probably blurred and more shaded areas in the process, and indeed, by the way, the autonomization of certain regions, like especially in the Flanders, in the Netherlands, let's say, in the Middle Ages, kind of date back to this time, because those were relatively depressed areas. I mean, the Netherlands were definitely very rich at the time. Belgium was, but those were areas that gained their sense of independence of things, as you can see also with the, I don't know, historically with these Flanders that always kind of wanted to remain autonomous and independent, because the Carolingians began to actually grant a lot of autonomy to the local vassals in order to cope with the Viking threat. And as I was discussing also more in detail in that video made on the Capitoli of Pistre, Charles the Bold issued in, especially along the Seine River, a lot of the building of certain fortified bridges that were particularly effective against the Viking raids, because if anything they obliged their ships to stop and to try to assault them. So these fortified bridges were built in many places, including Pistre. That was the first place where, in fact, the edict had been emanated for these things to happen. And it has happened also in Paris, Charenton-le-Pont, Auvers, on the Oise River, this one, in Pontoise, and Trilles-Bordoux. So on many important centers, and in this sense were over rivers, and that were and therefore more more likely to be hit by the Viking raids. The main problem in there, however, was, I mean, this measure was pretty effective, telling the truth, but the main problem was not about building this thing. It was these fortified bridges, but rather to man them. I mean, to have the garrisons to guard them and to be, because this was the problem. Sometimes the Franks mingled with the Vikings. This is something that is often overlooked, but there were certain local Frankish lords who actually were cooperating with the Vikings against the central authority, hoping that they would, and this would bring to the ruin of them, because certain local populations started rebelling to the same lords and actually appealing to the Frankish king. So this, paradoxically, by a certain extent, the Viking threat into Western Francia strengthened the Frankish the Western Frankish monarchy, and maybe France exists today just because of that, because the Western Frankish kingdom eventually evolved into France. At a certain point, was not even meant to survive at this extremely turbulent post-Carolingian phase. Also, usually, therefore, only the biggest centers were usually better organized. For instance, Paris had a consistent garrison, while other fortified bridges were attacked by the Vikings during while they were still under construction. So, pretty clever thing to do if you're a Viking. You're traveling, you see someone was building a fortified bridge to stop you. You're a simple person. You go simply destroy it and slaughter everyone. So, as we famously know, the Carolingians also and their successors started to even grant certain lands of the empire to the Viking raiders, and this was actually normal in perspective. It's not really necessarily a matter of weakness. It could be also actually something positive for the same unity of because these settlers would hopefully, let's say, try to repel other invaders who wanted to seize those very lands. And generally speaking, these Vikings, as we see especially with the Lower Seine, with the Duchy of Normandy given to Rollo in 911 by Charles the Simple in Normandy, they kind of mixed pretty quickly with the French population. So we have these things. For instance, Harold the Clerk was granted lands in Frisia in 826, so already at the time of Louis the Pious, so it's pretty early in time. Rorik, the famous Rorik, I also made a video about the early medieval Russia, because this guy was seemingly the one that had dealt with the Franks in the west and went into Russia to find its own dynasty in there. With the Varangians, and he was granted land by Lothar in the mid of the 9th century, and also Godfrey, this other figure, in 882 by Charles the Fat. So as we were saying before, there was a lot of warfare naturally ongoing with the Vikings, but as always, these bands were also pretty much from both sides. Like, Viking mercenaries were pretty common into Frankish armies at a certain point, and there was a lot, and this was mostly done also, as we said before, by the same Franks to fight against other Franks, or to send Viking raids against a rival, stuff like that. So this weakened sensibly the monarchy, but not much because of the Vikings themselves, but because of the same Franks basically turned them one against the other. This is pretty interesting. There are many battles, for instance, many figures more than else who fought constantly with many literary figures. There is the Nithard, who was a famous Frankish historian. It was known as but the son of Charlemagne and Charlemagne's daughter Bertha. His father was Angilbert, and he actually was an abbot, but he fought on horseback. He's one of the very few sources about Carolingian. For instance, about the Battle of Fontenoy. The Battle of Fontenoy is this huge clash that happened in June 841, and to which Nithard participated, and he was from the side of Lothar, and there were just like two sources on this battle, the one of Nithard and the one of a guy from Italy. And what is striking is that he was a clergyman, but he was a fighter. He was a warrior, just like any other aristocrat. It was perfectly normal by Carolingian standards. And this guy, by the way, it's strange because he wrote about a battle in a purely, and he had participated, he was an eyewitness to it. Nevertheless, he wrote that only from, in the typical historiographical mindset at the time, that is essentially watching that Wu had God's favor and making it a religious point, and nothing else. And this guy instead was a perfect warrior, and maybe really he didn't write much exactly because of that, because if he had been a bit more literate, or at least a bit more educated for Frankish standards, he would have told us more about this battle, about which we practically don't know anything. By the way, the only battle in all Carolingian military history that is actually explained from a tactical point of view is the Battle of Zuntel. It was also, by the way, a famous Frankish defeat against the Saxons. So go check it out if you're interested. It's a beautiful. It also explains how cavalry works and how Saxon infantry did. Because that was their culture, and this guy was actually killed in his late 40s, probably during a Viking raid. He was clashing. I think he fell like into an ambush, into a Viking ambush, and fought and died in this clash. I'm not even sure, because I learned this at university once, and I haven't checked out if it is true, but I mean it really makes you understand what the mentality of these people was, you know, and how the Franks really were, because we don't have to be fascinated, but these Franks were all about war. They're very simple to understand. We're very simple-minded people. They were all about war, their own personal gains from their family, for their descendants. And it's incredible what they actually achieved. And they changed the history of Europe forever. Today, now I want to stop because this video is excruciatingly long, but just to make you reflect on what their mindset could really be. I will keep talking extensively about the Franks. I hope I will have the chance to make many videos on them. This was just a bit of a overlook over the whole situation. I hope, yeah, it wasn't complete, and there's still many things that we have to look in way more detailed, and we're more detailed fashion. But I hope I got you kind of at least some perspectives about certain key point of the Frankish military and society. So for now, I hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.